Hey guys, now in this short playlist we are going to understand Azure CLI versus Bash versus PowerShell. Now we will cover every concept with simple explanation with simple demo. Now in this video we will understand Bash versus PowerShell. So as of now we are not going to discuss Azure CLI. Then in our next video we will understand Azure PowerShell. And then finally in our subsequent video we will understand Azure CLI in detail and we will also understand why we should use it. And now let's understand Bash versus PowerShell. Now guys, if you see this screen, we have this Windows machine and we have this Linux machine. Now in this Windows machine, if you observe, we have this green box. So this green box is nothing but PowerShell shell. So again guys, PowerShell, it is a shell, that is it is an environment, okay, and a shell or an environment, it is used to interact with underlying operating system. So again we have this Windows machine, inside that we have this PowerShell shell, and inside that if you observe we have this PowerShell terminal. So this PowerShell terminal is nothing but user interface. So from this PowerShell terminal we can execute PowerShell commands. So for example we can execute a command to create a file. So again from this PowerShell terminal, that is from this user interface, we can execute this PowerShell command because we have this PowerShell shell, that is this PowerShell environment. Similarly on Linux machine we have this Bash shell, that is this Bash environment, and we have this Bash terminal. So again it is user interface. So from this Bash terminal we can execute Bash command. So for example we can execute a command to create a file, and again as you can guess we can execute this Bash command from this Bash terminal because we have this Bash shell or because we have this Bash environment. If you don't have this Bash shell or Bash environment, obviously our Bash command will not work. So summary at high level, you can understand that Windows machine, it has this PowerShell, that is PowerShell environment, and this Linux machine, it has this Bash shell, that is Bash environment. So Bash versus PowerShell, so both are shells. But what is a shell? So shell, it is an environment using which we can interact with the operating system. So for example, we can create a new file. And again Windows machine, it has PowerShell shell, Linux machine, it has this Bash shell. Now guys, I know you might still have some doubts, so let's actually see a demo. So what we will be doing in this demo? So first we will create Ubuntu VM in Azure. So again, as we have just discussed, this Ubuntu VM or this Linux machine, it will have that Bash shell. So we will also have the Bash terminal. So from this Bash terminal we will execute a command to create a file, and again we can execute this Bash command because behind the scene we have this Bash shell, right? And then we have our local laptop which has Windows. So by default it has this PowerShell shell and this PowerShell terminal. So from this PowerShell terminal we will execute a command, that is PowerShell command, to create a file. And again we can execute this PowerShell command from this PowerShell terminal because behind the scene on our local laptop we have this PowerShell shell, that is this PowerShell shell environment. Okay, and now let's actually see the demo. So guys, we are in Azure and we are creating a new virtual machine. So basically we have to provide the required fields, but important image, we have to select the Ubuntu image, and then under authentication type you can select password, and here you can provide your username and password to connect to this Ubuntu VM. Okay, now guys, I have already created this Ubuntu VM, okay, and we are under overview, and this is the public IP to connect to this VM. So let's copy it. Now guys, to connect to this Ubuntu VM we need something called putty. Now in the description of this video I will share the link to download and install putty, and I have already installed putty on my local machine. So let's click on this start, and here I will say putty. So let's open it. Now here we need to provide the public IP of our Ubuntu VM. So let's provide that. I will say open. I will say accept. And now here we need to provide the username and password, that is username and password which we used when we created this VM. So I will enter it. So this is the username and this is the password. Now guys, we are connected to our Ubuntu machine. Now guys, this screen which you are seeing in this video, this is a terminal, and from here we can execute bash commands, and we can execute the bash commands because behind the scene on this Ubuntu VM we have bash shell or bash environment. Okay, now let me just clear the screen. Now let's see if we have any files in this default directory. So I'll say ls, and you can see there is no file. So now let's create a new file. So here I will say touch file5.txt. Let's say enter, and now I will say ls, and you see we have this new file, that is file5.txt. So again, what you are seeing on the screen, it is bash terminal, and this command, this is bash command, and again we are able to execute this bash command because behind the scene we have this bash shell or bash environment. Now similarly, let's work with PowerShell. So I will simply minimize this screen. Now I am back in my local laptop, and this is my Windows laptop. So by default, if I go to this start and if I type PowerShell, guys, can you see this Windows PowerShell? So this is the terminal, that is PowerShell terminal, using which we can execute PowerShell commands. Now let's simply open it. So guys, what you are seeing on the screen, that is this blue screen, this is a PowerShell terminal, and from this PowerShell terminal we can execute PowerShell commands, that is we can execute PowerShell commands to interact with this Windows operating system, right? And we can execute this PowerShell commands from this PowerShell terminal because behind the scene on this machine we have this PowerShell shell, that is PowerShell environment. So now let me just say clear, that is CLS. Now here I will say cd, go to this folder, that is Azure test, and now let's create a new file in this folder. So I will say new item and file name, and I will say enter. So you can see new file has been created. Now here if I say directory, and we can see all the files in this directory. So from this PowerShell terminal we can execute these PowerShell commands because behind the scene we have this PowerShell shell. Okay, now guys, in this video we have just discussed how we can interact with the underlying operating system, but we have not discussed how we can connect to Azure cloud from PowerShell terminal or from bash terminal, right? So that's it guys for this video. Thanks for listening.